Hey guys, welcome back. It's Missy. And guess what, guys? It's Libra season, which means that my birthday's coming up. It's on the 2nd. Shout out to all my Libras out there. What about you guys? When's your guys' birthday? Leave it all in the comments below. Anyways, today's video is on how being raised by a narcissist affects you as an adult. Being raised by a narcissist is really difficult because you're pretty much being raised by a child stuck in their trauma in an adult body. So because of this, you will find yourself basically catering to that narcissistic parent a lot, and you don't get to form a sense of self. You don't get to learn how to have healthy boundaries. You don't get to learn what healthy relationships look like. And so it can be really traumatic. So it affects you in a way that other children don't have to deal with. One of the first things that you may notice about yourself is that you will assume a lot when it comes to other people. Now, assuming is normal, but when it comes to when you were raised by a narcissistic parent, you had to try to read their minds a lot, and you had to assume, oh, they're behaving like this, so it means that this is what's gonna happen. And you may notice yourself being very observant, observant with other people around, because you always had to try to protect yourself. You knew that if mom was stomping around, that meant that she was gonna lash out on you. So you may notice that you're very observant and you try to assume and try to predict people's patterns a lot more than other people, because you always were in survival mode, and you took that with you as an adult, where you always feel like you're in survival mode now. And you may notice yourself trying to make things more comfortable, more consistent, because you dealt with a lot of inconsistencies. So you will try to predict things that are completely out of your control. And because you were so used to dealing with an unhealthy parent, when you assume with other people, it may be at a left field, and they'll be like, what? Where is that coming from? So let's say, like, for instance, like someone doesn't reach out to you. You may be like, oh, they're giving me the silent treatment. Like, I know now, like, I'm gonna have to make amends. I'm gonna have to make them feel better, when nothing even happened. That person was busy, but you assume that they're mad at you. So you'll notice yourself doing little things like that, where you just assume the worst, or you will try to predict things in order to create some safety, so that way you know your next move on how to protect yourself. The next thing is that you don't have a strong sense of self. So you may notice something about you is that it's really easy for you to be kind of a chameleon in different surroundings. Like, it's really easy for you to get along with different people in different settings, because that's what you had to do with your narcissistic parent. You had to be exactly who they wanted you to be, or they needed you to be, in order to survive. When you have a narcissistic parent, you will also struggle with these feelings of never being good enough. Like, they made you try to reach these unrealistic expectations, so you always felt like you were trying to catch up to be enough to get their approval. And that's another reason why you'll struggle with a sense of self, is because you were always trying to uphold their expectations of you. And you also were most likely terrified to have needs, because you were always made to feel like you couldn't have wants or needs. You couldn't have feelings. You weren't allowed to be your own person. You had to be exactly who they needed. And you may also notice that you run on fear and guilt. So a lot of the decisions you make are based off of preventing trying to feel bad, or based off of you being afraid something's going to happen. You may be pleasing other people. And so you don't really make decisions based on yourself, on what you actually want. Not only that, but you most likely struggle with a lot of self-doubt. And that's because you're a narcissistic parent instilled that self-doubt in you constantly about your decisions and how you should or shouldn't feel about certain things. So it's very confusing. So it's a lot easier for you to make decisions based off of other people, and also based off of your fear and your guilt, rather than your actual needs, because you have no idea really what your own needs are. And even if you do, you're terrified to even go with them, to even make them clear, because you knew in the past you felt helpless and like those things didn't even matter. So you always feel this sense that you don't matter. And you not having a strong sense of self also causes other people to take advantage of you, and it's a lot easier to manipulate you and to then go into more narcissistic relationships, whether that's with friends or even partners. The next thing, you may notice you deal with a lot of self-blame. Not only were you most likely blamed a lot for different things and made to feel like things were your fault, but it also was the fact that as a child, we crave our parents' love and affection. We crave our parents to accept us. So you take that mindset as a young child, oh, if I fix this, maybe daddy will love me. Oh, if I was this type of person like mommy says, then I will be loved. And so that kind of mindset makes you feel like things are your fault. So now as an adult, aside from, like I said, hearing your parents' voice constantly blame you for things that are so small and literally probably had nothing to do with you, I'm sure there's been instances where you had no control over something and it had nothing even to do with you and you somehow were blamed. You now as an adult have that voice in your head and also always have those thoughts of, well, if I did this, like this wouldn't have happened, it's my fault. So you constantly will put blame on yourself. And that also hurts you because in your relationships, you will always take accountability and you will not notice that maybe there's certain people that are not taking accountability. So you will constantly focus on yourself and fixing yourself, and when you may not even be the issue. Maybe you're a part of it, but you're not 100% the issue. So you will constantly take blame and feel like things are completely your fault. The next thing, you may deal with something I like to call fake guilt. And what fake guilt is literally like you feel guilty for things that have nothing to do with you or not your fault, or even simple things like taking care of yourself. You may notice it's very easy for you to feel guilty. Even if the person is not trying to make you feel guilty, like if you don't do something someone wants, you could immediately feel guilty like you're doing something wrong, and that's that fake guilt. It's this constant feeling like you are wrong or you're doing something wrong. So when you have a narcissistic parent, they're very selfish and they're very self-centered, and they will project onto you that you cannot have needs and you cannot be self-centered because they literally think that they are this selfless person and they are not self-centered. So then they are like, oh, you cannot be self-centered. But in reality, they're projecting because they are the most self-centered. And so as a kid, you may ask for simple things like, hey, I'm hungry, can I have something to eat? And your parent will be like, no, how dare you think about yourself? Like, there's other people that are hungry too. You know, little things like that can make you feel guilty for having needs. Not only that, but whenever you maybe didn't do something that they had wanted, they would make you feel guilty for. They will constantly put guilt on you. So you are this person where you may notice as an adult, you run on guilt. So you will constantly feel guilty for things that you should not feel guilty for, that are not actually wrong. Because guilt is literally just a feeling where you feel like something's wrong, like you did something wrong. And a little bit of guilt is normal. We all have a little bit of guilt. You know, you steal something, you will feel guilty because you know it's wrong. So the thing is that you will feel guilty for things that a healthy person would not feel guilty for. Like maybe being a little selfish, like giving yourself things, like saying no to people. You will feel guilty for those things. And that is fake guilt. You kind of have to now relearn what is right from wrong, because you kind of get confused when you have a narcissistic parent about what's right and wrong. What is right and wrong is really subjective. It's all, everyone kind of defines it differently. And so you need to kind of figure that out as an adult, is what do I feel is right and wrong? And I need to stop making myself feel guilty for things like taking care of myself. So like I said, you will notice yourself feeling guilty, especially when you're doing things for yourself, especially when you're saying no. The next thing, you will notice you deal with insecure attachment, aka fear of abandonment. So it could go one or two ways. One, you could have avoidant insecure attachment, where basically you're very distant and you avoid people and you act like pretty much close relationships are like the plague. So you'll avoid them and you're very independent. You will notice yourself being very independent and feeling like you don't need people. You know people are not dependable, so you won't even try it. Or it could go the other way, where you have anxious insecure attachment, where basically you are very needy and you basically get angry at people when you feel like they're about to abandon you. And so when you feel that, you may notice yourself shutting people out or punishing them out of fear of them abandoning you, but then you come across as more needy. So it's like this negative feedback loop. And this is because your parent inconsistently took care of you. Sometimes they were there, sometimes they weren't. So it was very inconsistent. You didn't know when your needs were going to be met. And because of this, it made you very afraid of the world. It made you think as a child, if I can't be safe with my parent, then no one else is safe. Because that's where you get your ideals of how relationships will be as an adult, is based on the way how they treat you from an infant. Like we have memories. Maybe you don't have like the picture memory until you're 3, but your body and your brain has memories of how you're treated when you were even 6 months old. So you take that with you. And so, like I said, you may have major fear of abandonment, and you can react either by avoiding people or by being very needy and then punishing them when they don't meet your expectations. Which kind of goes into the next thing, where you don't trust yourself and you don't trust others. So here's the thing, you would have, as a child, you most likely heard a lot, like little subliminal messages like, oh, you need help with that, or, oh, that was really dumb, why'd you make that decision? So those little seeds that were implanted in your mind then kind of grow into you subconsciously constantly feeling that you cannot trust yourself. And not only that, but since you have an inconsistent parent, an inconsistent attachment, you don't trust your parents, which then causes you to not trust others, because trust is formed with your parents, and that kind of shows, like I said, how your relationships outside your parents will be like. So you don't feel like you can trust yourself, you don't feel like you can trust others. Your parent showed you through their words and their actions they were not trustworthy. They may have said that they were going to do things they never did. They may have, like I said those subliminal messages. So it always felt unsafe and like you couldn't trust them. So that then teaches you cannot trust others either, because you're like, well, they're acting like this, I can't imagine what people are going to act like in the real world, which then leads you to trust manipulative type people because that's what you saw growing up. So you feel like, oh, this feels familiar. Okay, maybe this is someone that I can trust. And it can feel like it's a very scary world where it's out of your control, like everybody is like this. But it doesn't have to be like that. It's important to be aware, so then you can learn how to trust yourself, what signs to look out for. And when you do that, then you will then learn who you can trust. Because there are trustworthy people out there. It's just finding them. And you'll be able to find them because you have the tools to trust yourself and you know exactly the type of people you want in your life. And the next thing, you'll most likely suffer from complex post-trauma. Complex post-trauma is different than PTSD because complex is literally something when it happens early in your childhood. It is from it happening long periods of time. It can be caused from your parent or your caretaker, or it happens from being alone for a long period of time, as well as if you're still in contact with that abusive person. So when you suffer with complex post-trauma, you will notice that you struggle with a lot of shame and guilt. So you'll shame and guilt yourself a lot. You have chronic anxiety. So you live in a state of fear and you have a lot of negative thoughts. You have difficulty controlling your own emotions, and you will feel this emptiness. And the emptiness is the lack of validation from your parents, and also you not having a sense of self. You'll have that emptiness feeling, and you will notice yourself trying to fill that emptiness through like drugs or sex or intimacy or work or drugs and alcohol. And it will work for a little while, but then you'll notice that it'll just come back. It'll keep coming back because you didn't heal that wound. It's still there. You're still having that empty feeling, the lack of validation and the lack of self-love. And it will also cause you to feel alone, like no one understands. And almost all people that have dealt with being with a narcissist suffer from complex trauma because you're dealing with abuse for long periods of time and you're being gaslit to believe that you're fine and they're caring and they're loving, and it's over and over and over again. It's a complete cycle. You will struggle with a lot of self-blaming and angry towards yourself and angry towards the other person, and it's a very painful thing to experience. So it's important to be aware that you most likely are suffering from this, and these are some of the signs. It's important to help yourself heal to get out of it. Now, this is specifically if you were parentified as a child. So these are usually like the scapegoats, but you will be a big caretaker. It kind of goes hand in hand with codependency, but you will notice like you're the first person where you're like, okay, I need to take care of these people. You felt like you had to grow up really fast, and you always constantly have to take on responsibility. And you may notice these lingering feelings of sadness because you had to grow up so fast that you didn't have a childhood. And also will feel sad because you had to be the parent. And this goes along, even if you weren't parentified as a child, you will always feel sad that you didn't have the parent that you had longed for. It sucks. It really sucks. Feeling like you had to grow up fast and you couldn't have that relaxing childhood experience like other people had. You had to always live in fear and have anxiety and have this sadness and these empty feelings. It sucks. So you may notice sometimes you will act out. You may notice sometimes you'll act in like an immature manner, like where you need to kind of relive your childhood and do kind of childish things sometimes because you didn't get to experience. Even if you're 35 years old, it doesn't matter. You may notice yourself just wanting to kind of maybe be immature and be reckless and do little things sometimes here and there because of the fact that you were parentified, which goes hand in hand with the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is you either are codependent or you have narcissistic tendencies, and it all revolves around ego. So the thing that narcissists and codependents have in common is that they both were not validated as children, and they both were very traumatized, and they didn't have their wants and needs met, and they didn't feel like they could be their own person. So with codependence, the way that they deal with this trauma, which like I said, it's usually the scapegoats that become codependent, is they then look for validation through approval of others. Like they're like, oh, this is how someone will like me. And they feel really good when they're helping others, when they're people pleasing, when they're fixing. That's how they get that validation, and it becomes really addicting. Like you need it, and that's the only way that you can kind of fill that emptiness. Now, narcissists are on the end of the spectrum. Those are usually the golden children. They will feel validated by being very selfish, where codependents are selfless. They're very selfish, and they get their supply by looking for people's reactions and by only thinking about me, like how do I fulfill me? And it's all revolved around ego. In both circumstances, their ego is very bruised, it is hurt, and this is the way they're dealing with it. Now, you may notice whether you have codependent tendencies or narcissistic tendencies, which, by the way, you could be a codependent narcissist, and you can have a couple of narcissistic tendencies and not be a narcissist, but you may notice that you do have a big ego to protect yourself. You may notice yourself being very defensive. You will notice yourself being very obsessed with like your image and how you're perceived by others, and that's both with codependents and narcissists. You can get very stuck on your image, how you're perceived, how people think of you. That's another thing when you have a narcissistic parent, is they constantly will put things in your head like, well, what will people say? How does that make us look? Kind of very about image. So then you take that on as an adult, and you will constantly think about your image and how you come across to others. And the ego is there to protect you. And that's why you'll notice you'll get very defensive about things, because it's the ego is kind of like it's like a lie to yourself to deal with things. So you'll tell yourself you are this certain type of person, or you had this certain type of childhood to deal with those wounds, so that you don't actually have to face the reality of things. And it also comes from the fact that as a child, you were beaten down, you were put down, you were hurt tremendously. So you put this ego to protect yourself in order to fight against any criticism. So it may be really hard for you to hear any type of criticism. So if you grow up with a narcissistic parent, you may notice you have codependence, you're codependent, you have narcissistic tendencies, and you care very much about your image, and you may be very defensive, and you may have a big ego to protect yourself. And the last thing, you are unsure of what healthy boundaries are. So when you grow up with a narcissistic parent, they don't allow boundaries. Like, that is their kryptonite. Like, they hate boundaries because boundaries are fences and they don't like to not be allowed to do whatever they want. So as a child, you may notice they disrespected your physical boundaries. So maybe you wanted the door closed and they didn't allow that, or they looked through your stuff. Or emotional boundaries, they would talk about things that made you uncomfortable, maybe your romantic relationships or your friendships. They'd get very involved with things. Maybe they'd go into your relationships and like talk about things that you didn't want them to talk about. They'd contact your friends and your partner, things like that. They may have touched you a lot, given you a lot of hugs, especially like something that I know a lot of narcissistic parents do is they'll like hug their child and say, I'm allowed to, like, I'm your parent. You can't tell me otherwise. And that's an excuse they use. Okay, I guess this is what's going on. I guess, you know, we out here, she's gonna be barking. Anyway, as I was saying, that's an excuse they use to do whatever they want because they think that they're entitled to you, and because you are their property, you're a piece of them, they own you. That's their mentality. And also because of that, you now don't know how people should treat you. You don't feel like you're allowed to say no. You don't feel like you are allowed to have boundaries. And so you may tolerate or welcome unhealthy things because you think it's normal. That's what you grow up with. That's what your parent did. So now you think it's normal. So it's important as an adult to be aware of that, and you need to allow yourself to say no and allow yourself to have healthy boundaries. And just understand what they did was not normal. What do you guys think? Leave it all in the comments below. And please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and share with someone that you think may need it. Until next time, thanks for watching. Bye, guys. What the hell was I saying? I lost my train of thought. We're almost done. Oh, I'm dropping things. This weekend for my birthday, I'm throwing myself a surprise birthday party. It's gonna be really cool. Only me and my dog are invited because we still quarantine. We're trying to be part of saving the world right now. Anyway, as I was saying, that's an excuse they use, and then you also feel alone